Welcome to the step-by-step directions for the Apple Woodblock Kit. Your kit includes a piece of green felt and a leaf template, a sponge paintbrush, a vinyl stencil, one wood block, and one wooden spool. For this project, you will also need a hot glue gun, brown paint, white paint, and your choice of apple color. I chose red. Paper towels for cleanup. A black permanent marker to create our seeds. Scissors to create our felt leaf. And I also recommend having baby wipes and a makeup sponge. Since I'm using a makeup sponge, I'm not needing rinse water, but if you're not using a makeup sponge, you'll need rinse water to change colors between project parts. So on your wood square, you're going to notice two very rough sides for the top and the bottom, and some rougher sides for the sides of the block. Choose your smoothest side to be where you apply white paint. So I'm going to give myself a nice heap of white paint and use my makeup sponge to apply the paint like I would a paintbrush to the side of the block. And I am doing a nice light coat as my first coat of paint. As with all of these projects, my rule of thumb is to start with a nice light coat. It will dry faster than a heavier coat. And so just have one nice solid light coat on to start. And apply extra coats in order to have a nice even white finish. My favorite part, watching paint dry. And so once that dried a bit, go ahead and add another coat of paint until it's as white as you would like it to be. So even in this lighting, you can see a stark difference from the white sides to the natural sides. So while that second coat dries, I'm going to go ahead and start working on my spool, which will be my apple stem. So I'm going to take a baby wipe, or you can wet a paper towel, add a little bit of brown paint after I give it a shake, and use the paint on the baby wipe to give a stained effect to my wood spool. Once that is completely covered, I'm going to set that aside in order to let it dry. We won't need it until later on in the project. Next up, I'm going to work on my green leaf. So I began by cutting out my stencil shape. And rather than tracing with a marker and ending up with black marker lines on my felt, I decided to just hold the stencil over my felt and cut around to create the leaf. To give a little more life to our leaf versus it being perfectly flat, I just rolled it up the middle lengthwise. I'm adding a dollop of glue at one end. I'm going to fold it up to create a little crease, and I'll hold that until the hot glue dries. And now we have a leaf to go with our stem. Back to our block. The white is still a little dry, so I'm going to give it a little fanning action and super warp speed. And then we'll just move on to the other sides of our block while our white side continues to dry. Add some red paint to get started. So for this project, I chose not to paint the bottom, and I'm just poured a bit of paint directly onto the side of my wood block versus using another container or giving myself one more thing to clean up after. And so I'm just doing a mixture of dabbing and brushing with the sponge brush to get my paint into all the little grooves of the wood block. And holding on to the top and the bottom of the block with a claw shape of my hand, I'm going to keep working around to the other two sides and painting them red as well. In case you're wondering where the blocks came from, an 8-foot post was purchased from a local home improvement store and cut down for each block for the project kits. Now I'm going to add some paint to the top and finish that off. So now I have one white side, 3 red sides, and 1 red top for my apple. Baby wipes to the rescue for some quick paint cleanup. And paint once again because it's still not dry. And making sure that my hands are completely paint free. I will then check the status of our white paint to see how close it is to being dry. No paint is transferring onto my finger, so now we're good. So then I'm going to peel off the apple stencil and place that on the side of my block. So I chose to do kind of in the middle with a kind of even spacing from the sides to the top to the bottom. And I'm just pushing that down using my finger, mainly concentrating on the edges of the stencil. And then using my white sponge again, lightly dabbing paint just over the edge of the stencil to help minimize any bleeding underneath the stencil when I eventually apply the red paint to this side. So the wood is porous and it wants to grab the paint and pull it through. So by using the same color as what's underneath my stencil, I am minimizing a bleeding effect by a darker color by having the light white color be what the wood block pulls through in case it does bleed. Because you'll follow the veins of the wood and see when your paint travels to places you'd rather it not. And so by sealing the edges with the white paint, we're just saying that if anything is bleeding through underneath, it's the white paint, which is the color we want there anyways. So now we're going to let that side dry. Give it a little help with my paper fan once again. And feel free in between these steps where the paint needs to dry to use a blow dryer instead, or just walk away from the project for a minute, take care of other things and come back to it rather than having to watch your paint dry. So now the white paint, since I did a nice light layer, is pretty dry. So I'm going to go ahead, add some red paint to my work surface and start filling in around my apple stencil. So you're not worried about painting over the stencil itself. We're working along the edge to fill in that white space to the edge of our block to help finish off our apple. So once again, I'm just using a mixture of light dabbing with a little bit of paint on my brush, not super heavy coats so it takes forever to dry. And just work your way around the stencil, covering all of that white from the edges of the stencil to your block edges. So it's just a little bit of paint, a little bit of dabbing, and keep working your way all the way around. And you can see with the red paint, the edges of the stencil really show up. But underneath that stencil, we still have our white. So it'll look like we're looking into our apple and its seeds inside by using the stencil to protect our white paint in that area. So once again, we're waiting for paint to dry. Any spots that you see that might need a little touching up, go ahead and add a little red paint there as well, or green paint or whatever your apple color is, since we're waiting for that front to dry anyways. Do a quick hand cleanup. And we're going to move on to attaching our stem and our leaf while the rest of our apple is still drying. So I chose to put my stem in the middle of the apple on the top and a leaf just coming off to the side. So I'm going to begin by gluing down my stem. And so I chose to add the hot glue to the bottom of the spool, or you can put a dollop on the top of your block, your choice. Next, I'm going to add a little glue to the end that I had already creased of my leaf. And add that near my spool. Just checking on my front, seeing if I need to do any touch-ups as that red starts to dry. As the wood absorbs the paint, you might find little areas that need a little more. So the sides are still a little wet. But I'm going to go through and do one more layer of paint around my stencil. With the white paint underneath, it may take a few coats in order to get the front of your apple to have a color consistent with the sides of your apple due to the white paint being underneath. So my recommendation is just keep adding paint layers until you're happy with the coloring being consistent on all sides of your apple. While I wait for that to dry, do a little cleanup of my work area. Unplugging my hot glue gun since I'm done using that. And bringing my permanent marker closer because that'll be the next thing I need to use once I peel off the stencil. So I'm just going to grab for a pair of tweezers. To help lift up the edge of my stencil. Again, you can use a craft knife for this if your apple is completely dry. You can also use a fingernail. But I'm just going to use the tweezers, pull that up. And then using my black permanent marker, add one seed to each side of my apple. These are just small oval shapes. You can always Google a picture of the inside of an apple if you need a reference. And although not 100% dry, there is my apple project. Thanks for joining me.